Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. The first experience happened 11 years ago. I was around 16 years old. I was a pretty wild child and had quite a grown-up figure for my age. My friends and I liked to dress up, and we often tried to sneak into clubs. The legal age is 18 here in Australia, but they didn't used to check ages at the door very much. We would get guys to buy us drinks, as they typically checked your age only at the bar. We did this almost every weekend for quite some time, and nothing bad ever happened, until one night. One night in the middle of winter, we had a guy buy us some vodkas. From that point forward, I have no memory. I barely remember his appearance. He seemed like an average guy in his early 20s. I woke up freezing and coughing. My eyes stung from dust or sand. My mouth was so dry and full of dirt. The cold seemed to pierce my bones. I had the worst headache I'd ever experienced. Eventually, I was able to sit up. It was just before dawn, and there was some light, but not much. I started to freak out when I realized I was not entirely buried. There was about an inch of dirt on top of me. I still had my dress on, but no shoes. I couldn't think straight, but I knew something terrible had happened. I must have been kidnapped. From what I could tell, I was in a rural area, like a grazing paddock. I saw a road about 400 meters away and a few cars driving down it. It took me ages to walk to the road. I was incredibly dizzy and kept losing my balance, landing on my knees, which were now cut up and bleeding. When I finally reached the road, I flagged down a car. Thankfully, they stopped. A kind woman helped me into her passenger seat and draped her coat over me. I couldn't stop shivering, either from the cold or from shock. She kept asking me questions, my name, what had happened, but I couldn't answer. After a few minutes, I must have passed out again. When I woke up, the sun was up, and I could hear her talking on the phone. She said she had me, and I overheard her telling someone she would wait for them. I freaked out, thinking she was taking me back to the kidnappers. I started screaming, which caused her to crash her car into a ditch. She stopped, opened the car door, and ran onto the road, trying to calm me down. Then I saw red and blue lights from a distance. It was the police and an ambulance. That's who she had been talking to. About 20 minutes into the ambulance ride, I became more coherent. They told me I had been reported missing the night before. When my friend couldn't find me in the club, she called my parents. After the club closed, they found my wallet and coat. The police immediately acted on the missing persons report, since I was still a minor. The working theory is that I was drugged at the club and taken away. The doctors found no evidence of interference, but thought I might have overdosed on a drug. Perhaps the guy thought he had killed me and decided to bury me. They believe I laid in the shallow grave for most of the night. I'll never know exactly what happened, but the police opened an extensive investigation. They reviewed security footage and sent photos of the guy who bought me a drink, but there was never an arrest. The scariest part is that it all started as just a regular night. I live in a rural town in Australia, so I'm used to seeing kangaroos and hares when I walk alone. One Saturday, I decided to explore a trail I had discovered about 30 to 40 minutes from my house. The trail begins as a bike track, and after a while, it forks. Going left takes you back to the start, while heading right leads you down a narrow path where barely two people can walk side by side. I chose the narrow trail. Usually, the area is filled with birdsong and the sounds of wildlife, but this time, all I could hear was the wind rustling the trees and the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The silence was unnerving, but I kept walking for 10 to 20 minutes before I noticed something strange. I began hearing the crunch of leaves behind me, as if someone was trying to follow quietly. I brushed it off at first and kept walking, but soon, I heard a loud crack, a tree branch snapping as though something heavy had stepped on it. I froze, my heart racing, and scanned the tree line. Then I saw it, a figure ducking behind the trees about 100 to 200 meters away. This wasn't a kangaroo. It was roughly 6 feet tall, with abnormally long arms that stretched from its shoulders to the ground. Its head tilted at an unnatural 90-degree angle, almost as if it wasn't connected to its body. The sight sent a chill through me, but what truly terrified me were its eyes. They stared at me through the bushes, piercing, unblinking, and predatory. I felt like prey in the presence of an apex predator. My body reacted before my brain could process what I had seen. I bolted. As I sprinted, I heard the unmistakable sound of leaves and branches snapping loudly behind me, as if something big and fast was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. My heart pounded, and adrenaline coursed through me as I ran, desperate to escape. Then, I heard it, a high-pitched screech unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It was an ear-piercing sound no normal vocal cords could produce. Overcome with fear, I dove behind a large dirt mound, trying to quiet my breathing to avoid detection. Moments later, I heard it again, leaves crunching, this time on the other side of the mound. My heart stopped as the creature bolted past me at an incredible speed. I couldn't believe it hadn't caught me earlier. I sat there, frozen in terror, for what felt like hours as the daylight faded. Eventually, I knew I had to move. If I stayed until dark, I'd have no choice but to use my phone's flashlight, and that would make me an easy target. Summoning all my courage, I got up and sprinted back to town. The rest of the day was oddly normal, but I've never been able to forget what happened. I've avoided that trail ever since. Whatever that thing was, I've never seen or heard anything like it again, and I hope I never do. I'm just grateful I hid when I did, otherwise, I wouldn't be alive to share this story. My friend Jess is an Australian travel influencer. She and her boyfriend travel around Australia in a van, sharing great beach locations, restaurants, clothes, and other lifestyle content. They earn enough from it to keep them on a perpetual holiday. One time, they were on a deserted beach in the Northern Territory. Technically, they were trespassing on native land where access was restricted. The beach was stunning, and they spent hours taking photos, including bikini shots, and setting up a picture-perfect picnic. After about 2 hours, a group of Aboriginal kids arrived, 4 boys aged between 10 and 14. They called Jess and her boyfriend a few names and told them they weren't allowed there. Taking the hint, Jess and her boyfriend began packing up their things. Unfortunately, the picnic setup was elaborate, so it took some time. As they were packing, they noticed the kids had caught a goanna, a sizable Australian lizard, and were killing it by hitting it against a rock. Jess and her boyfriend felt unsettled by the violence but didn't say anything, knowing it was part of traditional hunting practices. Then Jess had an experience she described as one of the strangest in her life. Suddenly, all the sounds around them disappeared, the wind stopped, and an eerie silence set in. The kids noticed it too. Jess then heard murmurs coming from the trees beyond the beach. The murmurs sounded like angry voices. Scanning the tree line, she and her boyfriend initially saw nothing. However, Jess began catching glimpses of something moving among the trees. It seemed human, but too tall and unnaturally pale. Most people in the area were Aboriginal, but these figures were white, strangely so. Jess couldn't focus on them properly. Every time she tried, they seemed to vanish, always just out of clear sight. She estimated there were at least 10 figures. The kids began to panic, calling out that the mimics were there to punish them for disrespecting the goanna. The murmurs grew louder and angrier. Jess described the feeling as similar to scuba diving with a tiger shark, the overwhelming sensation of being prey. Her instinct screamed at her to leave immediately. Jess and her boyfriend jumped into their car, ready to drive away. The kids ran up, screaming and pleading to be let in. Despite her boyfriend's objections, Jess allowed them to pile into the back seat. As they drove down the dirt road through the trees, Jess scanned the bushland for the figures, but saw only the typical Australian landscape. When they reached the main road, they let the boys out. Jess offered to drive them home, but they refused and said they would walk. Later, Jess researched what a mimi was. According to Aboriginal folklore, mimis are ancient spirits that taught the first humans how to hunt and use fire. They are said to be tall, thin, and elusive, dwelling in the bushland. Though usually calm, they can become hostile if their land is trespassed upon or their pets harmed. Jess and her boyfriend, who don't believe in anything supernatural, were left wondering if there are things in this world we don't fully understand. Another time, while traveling, Jess and her boyfriend checked into a hotel in a small country town. Their van's toilet was broken, and they wanted a break from van life. This hotel was more luxurious than their usual accommodations, a beautiful old homestead. While waiting to check in, Jess chatted with another guest who asked if they were ghost hunters. When Jess asked why, the guest explained the hotel was one of the most haunted places in the state, with stories of an old man, a young woman, and shadowy figures of children appearing in mirrors and glass. Jess looked concerned, and the concierge reassured her with a smile and a wink, telling her there was nothing to fear and to ignore anything she might see. That night, her boyfriend proposed during dinner at the hotel restaurant. Overwhelmed with joy, Jess said yes and wanted to document the moment with photos. She went to the bathroom to fix her makeup. While at the mirror, Jess saw a blur behind her. Thinking someone had entered, she turned around, but no one was there. Looking back at the mirror, she saw a shadowy figure lurking in one of the cubicles. It only appeared in the mirror and not in the room itself. Jess wasn't scared, remembering the concierge's words. As she ignored the shadow, it seemed to grow agitated. Its movements became jerky, and it rushed out of the cubicle in the reflection, clawing at her. Jess felt nothing and refused to let it ruin her night. When she finished fixing her makeup, she turned around, saw nothing, and returned to the restaurant as though nothing had happened. Jess's encounter left her open to the idea that there might be things beyond our understanding. My friend Luke, a doctor, also has a couple of unexplained experiences. Luke doesn't believe in the supernatural, but admits there are events he can't explain. The first happened when he was 19 and still living at home. It was nearly midnight, and his parents were asleep. Walking past his younger brother's room, he noticed the neon glow of his brother's gaming computer. His brother, a huge gamer, never left it on when he wasn't home. However, the room was empty, and nothing seemed out of place. Luke suddenly felt the urge to call his brother, something he never usually did. His brother answered, revealing he'd been in a fight and needed a ride home. He hadn't called their family out of fear of getting in trouble. Luke agreed to pick him up. When he looked back at the computer, it was off. He touched it, and it was cold, as though it had never been on. Another time at the hospital, Luke was doing his rounds. A terminally ill cancer patient, who was expected to live another 6 months, had recently been admitted. That evening, Luke found the man holding hands with a middle-aged woman. Luke was surprised, as he'd been told the patient had no living family. Due to COVID restrictions, only immediate family were allowed to visit. The man introduced the woman as his sister. She smiled but didn't speak. As Luke left, the man said, "I'm glad I got to see you tonight. I wanted to say goodbye." Luke laughed, assuring him he'd check on him the next day. That night, the man passed away unexpectedly. None of the staff recalled seeing a visitor, and Luke couldn't explain who the woman was. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.